Hey everybody, it's Mick here from Climate Salad. We have just tipped over 500 webinars for the climate tech community of Australia. We always love bringing in really interesting people with deep backgrounds to talk about these big challenging things we're all working towards. And today to talk about biodiversity and its wonderful opportunities is Greg. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
No problems. Thanks, Mick. Thanks for the opportunity.
No, it's great. Look, really, really great. A lot of interest in this area. Starting, Greg, we just would love to hear a bit of your background and what you do and what got you into to biodiversity.
Oh, what got me into biodiversity? Growing up in the Blue Mountains was probably a good start. So, surrounded by biodiversity pretty much for my formative years. Initially down on the coast at Randwick, so a bit of marine experience, and then moving up to the mountains full time, attending school up there. And that gave me an intro to it. I've since worked for about 27 years with New South Wales Environment Agencies under 14 different names over 27 years. Uh, moved desks only four times. What a surprise. Uh, but that meant that I've worked across much of New South Wales in wetlands, drylands, mapping, been involved in vegetation surveys across New South Wales, big bioregional surveys, but also because of my experience and my exposure to a lot of the state, became involved with native veg management, initially from the concept of State Environment Planning Policy, SEP 46, and taking it from there. So I was involved in development of the tools that have been used and are now used to assess and quantify the biodiversity impacts of development and also to the opportunities presented to landholders such as myself. And I declare here I have a stewardship site, the opportunities to provide private conservation outcomes as a result of funding by development processes. So looking at that financing side of things. Yeah, so, but 4 years ago, struck out myself and my business partner, finally decided, yes, we need to do this properly. I wasn't quite given an ultimatum from the department of either you can talk conservation or you can do it, but you can't do both. And I decided, well, I got into this game to do it, so I'm going to do it. And that's where we are. 4 years down the track, we have about 3,500 hectares either under management or being assessed for management. Quite a few of those are ready to go or nearly ready to go as conservation sites once we have the acquisitions of the biodiversity credits to make them viable.
Oh, great! That's a really really good background. Climate Salad's 4 years old, and I think the departments we've worked with in New South Wales have also changed names 5 times in those 4 years. So it's that is a reality. So it's interesting. I think we're at an interesting point when you talk about biodiversity and natural capital, well, nature. I think we'd love to just be able to talk about it in being purely valuable and we want to look after it because nature is just so fantastic. But I think there is the reality that if we're unable to talk about it in economic terms and terms of value, then it's just hard for the rest of the world that does deal in money and profit and balance sheets and value and assets and investment to actually to help us get to a climate positive world. Can you talk about that? Obviously, that economic part, and how you see that, especially where we are now in this journey.
Yeah, well, I mean, we live in a capitalist society. So basically, everything does come down to it has to have a monetary value to be valued for the use of development, progress, whatever you want to talk about it. I mean, we've got the Productivity Commission and the Roundtable next week in Canberra. There's all sorts of ways in which, biodiversity, as you say, we need to value it for the fact that it supports all life on Earth, whether you like it or not. We are intimately and integrally dependent on nature and on nature providing those services to us of pollination, oxygen, water cleaning, all those, many and very facets. I mean, if you look at the basic value of climate, sorry, of biodiversity services and ecological services that are provided, it runs to the trillions of dollars that for almost all of human history has basically been treated as an externality that's free. And we've seen the outcomes of that sort of mindset in species lost. We're in the huge situation, or the scary situation of being in one of the largest extinction events the planet has recorded and being integral in causing that. We're looking at, system breakdown in places like, well, the large algal bloom off South Australia for the moment. That's a system breakdown effect. But how can we deal with these economically is always going to be a problem. And I like to talk about biodiversity in the context of treating it like currencies. Each individual species or ecosystem is a different currency. And that's where the like for like context comes in. So when you talk carbon, you're talking a single currency, you're talking carbon dioxide tons equivalent. When it comes to biodiversity, you can't necessarily correlate an ecosystem with a species or a species with another species. And whilst some systems, and New South Wales is leading the world in that, look at trying to capture that um, broad diversity that is biodiversity, it becomes a matter where you end up having to do some sort of lumping up. And as a result, there are nuances we're going to miss. There are situations where we can't quantify or we can't necessarily address loss. And especially as, there's talk about, we know maybe 10% of the invertebrates of the planet, if that. So, we've lost so much before we even knew what we had is, a big issue. I mean, we're talking now potentially the 27th species of vertebrate going extinct in Australia with the likely loss of the East Coast perch, the Shoalhaven perch. So, we're looking at changes that result not just from our clearing, but how we like to run our lifestyle. The uh, European naturalization societies have brought things like rabbits, foxes, um, trout to Australia and these have caused huge problems down the track. I mean, we can talk about the, the ecological cost of brumbies in the alpine areas and things like that. I mean, it's just, how do we quantify this? And that's where, in a lot of ways, the biodiversity offset scheme that runs in New South Wales is making an attempt at trying to quantify and identify how those costs can be dealt with in a commercial sense. The big issues then become, how well do you value what is a non-renewable resource? A biodiversity is restricted to a particular geography, whether it be dependent on a soil type or just climatic conditions. You can't say, oh, well, I'm clearing Cumberland Plain woodland in Western Sydney and I'm going to offset it with Cumberland Plain woodland in central west New South Wales where it's a lot cheaper. Cumberland Plain woodland doesn't occur out there. So you can't. And that's why we have a number of communities and things like the grassy white box, yellow box, Blakely's red gum, grassy woodland and derived native grassland, critically endangered, maybe 6% of its original distribution left. Cumberland Plain woodland, less than 6% of its original distribution left. Many, many of these communities have suffered from being impacted. And that's part of the problem is where they can only occur on particular soil types. And if those soil types are economically valuable for what we've valued as humans for centuries, millennia, i.e. agriculture, urbanization, then providing the offset, providing the capacity to recompense nature for that loss is generally priced at a value that doesn't recognize its true value to human society.
Yeah, there's so much you've touched on there, which is really, really interesting and so important. And I feel like it's highly unlikely we're going to have a global moment, let alone a national moment where we go, oh, of course it's valuable. Clean air, clean water, food. It's all interrelated. Yep, let's value nature better. And I think particularly considering we're here in Australia, where we are very, very fortunate in so many ways. And have so many natural assets still. And it also feels like we haven't had the moment yet, even though there's been any scientist will tell you we've had thousands of moments where our negative impact on the environment has had consequences. There hasn't been like one enormous explosion, and it's not going to like the loss of one species is not like just it's not so clearly and extrinsically it's not like an accident, right? It's not like a volcano explodes and like that thing just happened because it's such an ecosystem and it's so fragmented and it's so complex, and also because it happens over a long period of time. All those things make us value nature, make us our ability to value nature so challenging, which is why I think it's interesting this combination of understanding that and then biodiversity credits, like actually rewarding, punishing, and incentivizing people's behavior around the biodiversity credits. Can you talk to us a bit about those, like that as a mechanism, like the biodiversity economics, and what's the hope? Like, what's the hope that the outcome it produces?
Well, I mean, there's many ways in which we can talk about the hope and desire for an outcome. But if we look at a couple of things, first is the 30 by 30. So we've got Australia signed up to the 30% of land and sea resources under conservation management by 2030. Got a long way to go there, but biodiversity offsetting in New South Wales, which is written to title, it's in perpetuity. It's actually an IUCN Category 1 type reserve, so same as a national park or nature reserve. It has to be written to title. It can only be revoked by mutual agreement of the landholder and the head of the Environment Agency, so not quite ministerial, but not far short of it. So it has a high standard of outcome, and that's one of the targets that we have as a nation to meet is that. And globally, 30% is not that much when you think about it, especially when in Australia's opportunity, we can include pretty much 70% is out there in the western areas, and yeah, we don't have to worry about it too much. Well, that's wrong because as we know in New South Wales from the application of the comprehensive, adequate and representative reserve system for so many decades, you can preserve 30%, but if you're preserving 30% of land area and it's all, a limited array of types, you're still going to end up with enormous loss. So that brings into the next part of it. How do you value this? Well, I think the easiest way is to value what you're giving up by doing it. And this is what we've tried to orient our business around, is saying, well, if a landholder is doing conservation as a purpose, as a means of generating an income, then they have to be fairly and adequately compensated for giving up what they would otherwise. Now, you might think that's a small amount, but in the wheat sheep belt of New South Wales, so the majority of the agricultural land in New South Wales, you're looking at $400 per hectare per year of pure profit from grazing. So unless you replace that $400 per year over and above what you're doing to maintain and manage that environment and make it better, which is what the whole scheme is about, then why would a landholder participate? Why would a landholder see value in foregoing income of, that amount when, he's being or she is being asked to be burdened by societal's need for clean air, clean energy. So, it comes back to the simplest way in which we can start to look at rationalizing the value of biodiversity is by looking at what we're giving up to do it. And I think in New South Wales, that's poorly understood. And this is a big part of the problem. As I said, in our business, we don't even value it at 400 dollars per hectare per year. We'd love to, but in the way that the scheme is calculated, that would add um, for the average site of, say, 100 hectares, it would add several $1 million to the value of the total fund deposit, the amount that's put into a trust with New South Wales Treasury to manage, or they invest it, and then those payments pay for the in perpetuity management of the land. So in a lot of ways, that's a good part of the scheme in that it gives the developer a single upfront cost, divests them of their obligations to look after the environment, but that cost is put on to the landholder to provide that service in perpetuity. So when it comes down to it, if you don't replace that value, there's no incentive to do it unless you're doing it for philanthropic means or philanthropic reasons. And I mean, all power to them, AWC, WWF, all the other various entities around the place, South Endeavour Trust, they are doing what they want to do in that they're philanthropically managing the land. But as we can see, they'll pick up the cheapest blocks in the cheapest areas for what they can. Yes, they've got huge land holdings, but they don't pay much per hectare for them. Whereas when you come down to the like for like arrangement that's required, you've got to replace impacts to box-gum grassy woodland by a solar farm or a transmission line or a wind farm with box-gum grassy woodland. And if the landholder is giving up $400 per hectare per year before other costs like weed control, feral control, use of ecological fire, fencing management, all those sorts of things are taken into account, then the landholder is effectively giving it away for free. And where's the value in that?
Yeah, really interesting. But what's your view on, as you said, there's people like, I think probably most people on this call are saying we should value it more, we should value it immediately, we should value it fairly, and absolutely there's absolutely no replacement. Like you can't just pick it up and move it. I remember a Simpsons episode where they messed the town up by shoving all the rubbish underground, and then they just moved the town 2 miles up the road, and like there's just you even if you the absolute best is the best thing is just to leave it there and look after it and value it for where it is. But what's your sense of those people, I guess, who are struggling to understand that value and participate, like so governments, investors, corporates. If you're sitting here at Rio Tinto and you're like, there's a whole bunch of precious minerals under that ground, I want to go and get them out, and the government's saying that'd be great because we can get 10% royalties on that. That'd be really good for us. And we're saying, oh yeah, but there's nature there. You shouldn't do that. How close are we getting to an actual transaction where we say that the value is actually fairly equated in with the big powers who are not the ones who actually care yet?
Uh, when it comes down to it, that's essentially what the scheme is about. It's about saying you want to impact on this, you've got to pay for it. It's got to be part of your financial bottom line as well as your ecological and social bottom lines to have that impact. One of the things I've noticed, we're preparing for another seminar in a couple of weeks, talking on that very factor. Um, when it comes down to it, you look at the cost of biodiversity as a part of a project. And for brownfield development, it's almost nothing. For solar farms and BESS systems, it's not much more than, sweet FA, simply because those systems tend to be put in areas that are already heavily cleared. But when you come to linear transmission and other linear infrastructure, so roads, rail, power lines, gas lines, you start by very nature of those structures impacting on vegetation somewhere along the line. So, and threatened species. The next most impactful one is actually wind farms for the area that's developed because, again, usually they're put on places that are windy, which tend to be steep ridges and places like that that haven't been cleared in the past simply because they were economically non-returning for the landholder. Then you end up with mines, and mines typically have the highest proportion of their cost, their estimated development cost or their CIV, taken by biodiversity. For some of them, you can calculate it using sort of generalized credit prices that come from the market. And for one of the mines in Western New South Wales, it's looking at 22% of its cost is going to be biodiversity. Can the company justify that? Should the company justify that? Well, that becomes part of a cost of business. And this is where we come back to that initial statement that we made that without valuing biodiversity in the past as an externality, we have this mindset that it's why should it be that higher value? Well, is a mineral just as valuable as a species? That's where we're getting.
Yeah.
Do we have the situation where, we need this development? Well, can it be done more sensitively? Can it be done in the case of, after copper or gold or silver or whatever, can it be done with more underground and that sort of extraction processes more effectively for the outcome? If you are staring down the barrel of $100 million out of your $500 million project being biodiversity, is going underground to obtain your resource economically more effective. And potentially there's the opportunity to, once mining is completed, and depending on the style of mining you're doing, and won't go into long walls here, but certainly for your standard pit and stope mining that's done for minerals, the collapse, the overburden collapse that happens at the termination of mining is usually fairly limited and fairly small. So therefore, you possibly could retain that vegetation, and once mining finishes, provide that area as an offset for the next area you move into. So, there's economics there that aren't necessarily thought of more widely. Could
Mm.
be, because we've got to factor in that, and this is part of the problem is everything now happens on basically a 7-minute time frame. Thank you, Bluey. Um, so we end up with everybody thinking election to election or, at most a decade. These sites are going into conservation in perpetuity. They're offsetting what is considered to be an in perpetuity impact.
Mm.
So we have a time frame to play with. Well, what's the economics of this over that time frame? And I've talked already about the need to recompense the providing landholder with those funds to make the land valuable. And I've had discussions with bankers and loan managers who have said, well, if you don't put in that foregone income component, all the other actions that are funded out of the agreement, the weed control, feral control, fire use, fencing, all those sorts of things that I mentioned before, they are costed as though they go off to a contractor, and should be, because I mean the average landholder age in Australia is in their 60s now.
Mm.
So they're not going to be doing this for much longer. And in reality, no one lives forever. So therefore, you've got to work on these sites as at some stage someone else is going to be doing the work. So, you
Yeah.
know, you can't factor in those costs as being an income to the landholder because there are things that are required actions that the landholder cannot do. I mean, I'm lucky, I'm an ecologist. I can do the ecology surveys on my site.
Mm.
But almost every other landholder is going to be stuck with having to buy in that expertise at fair market rates in a market that is actually increasing in value because of the demand on ecologists to do the work. And this is one of the things we're finding is even the department has this concept that you can do an assessment for $50,000 now. Try 5 times that. So, it's like, well, we've had yeah, recommended costs of materials for fencing and well, fence installation at $13 a meter. And I'm thinking, yeah, no.
Mm,
I just paid $25 a meter, and that was a pretty good deal with a
mm,
friend. Um, so,
yep.
$13 a meter. And when challenged on it, they said, well, that's the price we've got. And I said, yeah, I know. I put it into the database you're using in 2012.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Things have changed.
and not only that, but we've got issues with the way the bureaucrats deal with this process. And I mean, as I said, I was a bureaucrat for 27 years, so I've got a bit of insight as to how they're thinking and what their expertise and experience is. Um, the way they think about it is we've got to make it cheaper for developers so that it's not an impediment on development. That's the wrong mindset, isn't it? If we're trying to make these things valued, we don't want to make them cheaper. And in fact, we've just got our most recent price from the agency that provides price guidance. And of the 70 odd credit types that we have available through the business, well over half of them have dropped in value in the last 12 months. But there's this little thing called inflation. All the costs are going up. So, why is it that, we can take a hit on the price that we can get for these credits sold for, and then also take a hit on, having these sites be sustainable, be worthwhile for an investor to look at. And I mean, investors, if it's not returning, above 5% and ideally above 10%, they're not interested. And that's a big part of it too, is we're not getting the investment because the returns are so small, because the department's, forcing the prices down. Developers are undertaking their own sites, which is fine. They should be. But the department doesn't then look at what they're saying, this is what we want in our offset stewardship site. So I've seen sites come through. They totally fail to account for just general on costs. They don't have money to cover rates. They don't have money to cover insurance. They don't have money to cover or the contingency money is less than the rates and insurance. So every year their contingency is gone before they even start to do the functions. And then they've priced all those actions at the lowest contractor rate. Well, that's great if you can get the lowest contractor, but if he's that low, he's probably being used on other sites all the time. So therefore, you know, I had a policy when I established my site, and I was asked, what costings do I want? I said, well, get three quotes and go with the highest. And the ecologist looked at me and said, why go with the highest? And I said, well, I can't guarantee I get the other two. So, it's a case of this scheme is being undermined by a desire to make everything cheaper. And while that's understandable, it's going to be unsustainable in the long term. And we already know of sites that basically the landholder has to fork in each year to
Mm,
meet the costs that aren't being able to be met with the values that were put into the site by the consultants. And I mean, I've already bagged out the bureaucrats. Now I'm going to bag out the consultants and say, well, a lot of them aren't private landholders and they don't have rural landholdings. So they don't understand the impact and the requirements of being a rural landholder when it comes to doing these sorts of things. And in all honesty, they have a client base, which is not the I'm going to see you once biodiversity offset supplier. It's the I'm going to rely on you to pay for the bread and butter developer. So the developer wants them to get the best price for the biodiversity offsets. The consultant is beholden to the developer to say, get us the best price for biodiversity offsets. We don't want to pay too much because, it'll affect our bottom line. And the landholder, who in most cases is being sold this story of, well, you'll get paid for doing the land management on this site forever. But here's the values. Um, they probably think about, oh yeah, well, I can do it myself for this value, so let's put that value in. Not thinking about the fact that when they're 80 and can no longer do it, they've still got to do it for that price.
right. Wow. Do biodiversity credits, I mean, talk about longevity there. Do they have some of the same challenges of carbon offsetting in terms of um the yeah, managing and tracking and just the integrity of it. And obviously there's a lot to it, but can you
Yeah,
tell us
no,
where that's at?
advantageously, the in New South Wales, and I mean, I can only really speak to the New South Wales scheme, but it is one of the world's best. So every year, the site that provides the biodiversity credits is assessed by the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. They come out, you're required to fill out annual reporting on what activities have been undertaken, where they've been undertaken, how long it's taken you to do those actions, what's changed. So they're looking at photo point assessments. Every 5 years, it goes through an entire ecological assessment again. And then you've got the annual report. You have to show that you've undertaken the actions that you were funded for that year before the next year's funding is released to you. So,
Got it.
yes, there is a lot more oversight to it than there is for the carbon market. The assessments are, in my experience, done by senior ecologist staff, so they do understand what you're looking at, what you're dealing with. And it does add a value and a level of expertise to administration of the scheme that is probably a little more lacking in the carbon side. When it comes down to it, though, it does rely on the both sides of the argument, the developer side and the offset side, being realistically able to compare like for like. So in New South Wales, because of the complexity of having, I think it's about 3,500 different plant community types and um, nearly 1,000 threatened species
Mm,
and another 100 odd threatened ecological communities, you've got the complexity there. They've reduced some of it by saying, well, a number of these species, and we're talking vertebrates here, or a select set of vertebrates, if the condition of the habitat being impacted is or being offset is this, then that species is likely to be using it. If it's a plant or if it's one of these more highly specialized species, then certainly you're required to find it. And that's another disbenefit to the landholder in that the stewardship provider has to prove the presence of the species, has to prove the habitats are there, whether that's through camera work or counting individual species of a tree and that sort of thing, before they can provide the offsets. Whereas the developer can say, well, we think this one is here, so we're going to have offsets for it. And the reason that this balance is happening is simply because the developer is not having to pay a significant amount for that credit. So they can assume that squirrel gliders are present on their development site because, the habitat is there, it's got hollows, it's got whatever, but they don't have to prove that squirrel gliders are there. The stewardship provider has to prove that squirrel gliders are there. So
mm,
we deploy cameras from when we acquire the site or commence work on the site until after the department does its review. So for some of our sites, we've had cameras out for 3 years. In that period of time, we get tens of thousands of images. If we're lucky, squirrel gliders come up on more than one. But then we get the next argument with the department of, oh, how can you prove it's a squirrel glider? And now they're asking us to look at things like trapping them, doing DNA, and a whole range of other things to prove that it's squirrel glider and not Kreft's glider. Um, the two species overlap
yeah.
spatially and in their characteristics. So, and we end up having to, for the cheapest of the animal credits, go to this massive expense otherwise. And the developer to offset ratio is usually around 10 to 1. So every
Wow.
every 1 hectare that a developer impacts, there has to be 10 hectares of offset on the other side. It's just the ratios go dependent on the condition of the site that's being impacted and the condition of the offset and all that sort of thing. So you can end up with negative values where
Mm,
the site is in such poor condition that it generates very few credits per hectare of impact, but the offset has the opportunity to improve significantly. But when you come down to it and end up with the opportunity for the species to, be actually present, then it becomes problematic. And, there's this imbalance in the system where
Mm,
we've got all this demand on squirrel glider credits, but not a huge amount of supply. And yet we're still having a government agency say that, oh, well, you can buy, we can buy your obligation for those, and then
mm.
we'll go and find them. And in our case, we keep missing out on those auctions for when they buy them from the market simply because we get told, oh, you're too expensive. Well, no, we're putting in a fair return for ourselves as landholders, plus an investment, plus the fact that, we're looking at, foregoing income to provide this. And yeah, we're more expensive than if the developer did it themselves, but is the developer actually costing it appropriately? So we get back to that secular argument.
Yeah, right.
Fun and games.
Yeah, I bet. Well, it goes a little bit to Andy's question around the there's obviously natural ways, and there's ways that we can be more definitely in tune with nature, and I think there's a lot to learn from obviously First Nations, Indigenous cultures on like living sustainably, and but there's obviously this tension between development and asset generation, cash generation, tax generation for the government, royalties, etc. And it feels like we're actually obviously I think we've had about 6,000 years as a species to work out how to manage money, and that's a very, very sophisticated process that everyone's really comfortable with. There is currency, it's understood, and obviously it's massively still messy, but you've got 6,000 years of sort of systems around it. Whereas even though a lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time, most people haven't, and the systems aren't there, and you're talking about so many big dynamics. Is it just something that's just going to take us time to work through, and everyone needs to, because you're talking about landholders again. You could be a fifth generation farmer, and you could talking to an investor who's used to looking at a balance sheet and seeing, here's a dollar and here's how I value it. And then you've
Hmm.
got a government which manages this way, and like everyone's going through this massive change. Um, how, is it just actually it's complex, but we're going to get through it? Or do you think there's actually like really key inflection points we need to go and create in order to get to some point of stability?
I think that we are working through it, but the big issues remain that a lot of the administration and management that is happening of the program and the process itself is not necessarily being adequately informed by participants. You get the policy driven outcomes that come from a policy person that thinks this is how it should work. Whereas in real world, we're finding that, that sort of thing doesn't actually fly. So we end up with a whole array of outcomes possible, but also too a whole range of opportunities. I think it does come back down to having recognition of the fact that to participate in this, you have to provide the landholder with a fair return. And without doing that, the scheme is always going to be pushing it uphill. If you made, credits as valuable as, say, an ounce of gold in the terms of, in the last, what is it, 2 years, gold's gone up 25%. Why are biodiversity credits going down in value? And yet they're becoming rarer. They're becoming more impacted. So, it's a case of coming back to that situation where, we had a minister say we want biodiversity to be cheaper, and somehow that's what's stuck in, rather than we want landholders in the rural areas who are supporting rural industries, providing expertise, providing, um, land management opportunities for people in the rural areas where we're losing people because there's no work opportunities. Why aren't we looking at this as a business generator rather than sort of an impediment on a particular business that's got a much smaller footprint?
Yeah, I think it goes to the question around that this is we are in a process and it will take some time, but I do
Yeah.
think it is going in the right direction. It's a great example. The fact that gold which just glitters. I mean, it obviously it does have some electronics functions, but it's really a store of value where investing in nature and biodiversity has is supporting um, is a store of value of humanity. But it just shows again that we're trying to do 6,000 years of catch up in a 20-year period, and it is really hard and complicated. Do are all landholders behind this, or are some people like thinking it's are worried about it, or they see it as a risk, or is everyone positive on that side?
I wouldn't say everyone's positive, or you would see a lot more uptake.
Mm.
There's other complexities that are around delivery of offsets, and the biggest one of those is courtesy of the tax office and the legislation that they manage, which says that entering into a or conservation agreement is a D4 event in capital gains tax terms, which means that you then have to value
Mm.
at fair market value the credits and pay that value within the next tax year. So if you're generating a site, and we have one site, 900 hectares, that's generating potentially up to $50 million worth of credits at fair market value. But, so suddenly we've got, 17 million less, three less, so roughly, $15 million worth of costs up front without having sold a credit. So there's issues there where the legislation itself becomes an impediment. And because of that, there's certainly hesitancy in landholders who will go right through the process and then stall it at the last hurdle by not signing their agreement to bring it into providing that offset because they don't have a guaranteed supply or purchaser. They look at this capital gains tax issue. And I mean, in all honesty, you buy shares, which in a lot of ways, that's what credits are. They're a share in improving the biodiversity outcomes. You buy shares. You don't have to pay the tax on what you're going to sell them for on the year you acquire them. You pay it when you earn that. And if biodiversity credits were dealt with the same way under a capital gains tax A1 event, then you'd probably find there'd be a lot more landholders participating in it. There'd be a lot more uptake in it. Um, so there's certainly
Yeah,
opportunities there that, you know, it is, and I mean, in all honesty, New South Wales government is seeking a class ruling on those actions
yeah,
and has been seeking it for nearly 3 years. So
mm,
it, the complexity is there for the government as well because it will require legislative change or just a clarification note in the legislation to say, in case of New South Wales, the D4 event applies only to the capital gains tax that would derive if the credits were sold for the value of the total fund deposit, land acquisition, assessment costs, and all the other base costs.
yeah,
So, there's opportunities there
sure,
that would grease the wheels to
yeah,
make the scheme work more efficiently, more effectively. I saw some comment made about blockchain. Certainly, that is being talked about as an option, but it's also because of the way the credits are sold in single units and that sort of thing. It's complexity is
mm,
more readily managed by the oversight by the department, and in all honesty, that oversight is what keeps the scheme more reliable, for want of a
yeah,
better term, than the carbon scheme.
yeah, yeah. That's yeah, it is really interesting to see how it's evolving, and I think it will take a little bit of time, and it is a lot more
Well, this is
complicated.
iteration number two in New South Wales alone. So,
That's right. That's right. And I think as well there's an increased burden on doing the right thing, and I think some people get frustrated about the green tape of stopping development to go in the wrong direction. But I think we've got to be impatient and impatient at the same time because we want to make sure we don't go, oh great, we need more biodiversity. So go do this thing, and all of a sudden we've gone off knee jerk in the wrong direction and end up creating more problems later. So I think it's I don't want to use that as an excuse not to take action, but I think as you've really outlined, it's not as simple as saying, well, biodiversity is valuable, so everyone should value it. Okay, everyone values it. Here's the price. Here you go. It affects everything basically, and that's why it's going to take it some time to trickle through. What do you see any like really significant inflection points coming up? Is there moments when we hit a certain threshold? Like what's the point in which it just becomes normalized and this becomes
A couple of
and we
those inflection points are starting to appear.
okay,
So we've
great.
got the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal in New South Wales has been tasked for the last 3 years to oversight the market and see how the market operates and what recommendations they can make. And they've made recommendations to the department over the last two reports. And hopefully this year they'll be a little more firm in how they're recommending things get done. There has been legislative change in New South Wales to start looking at biodiversity net gain as a requirement. So
Mm,
that sort of outcome is going to put more demand on the market. There's also change in that legislation that says that a developer has to go to the market and there will be certain credits that won't be able to be resolved through the Biodiversity Conservation Fund, the agency that takes on the obligations and then trusts to find the values later. They've also recommended in the IPART report that that value that's being given by BCF is actually significantly increased to make the the market work in that then the prices aren't that the price estimation service provide aren't that far off what is a reasonable return for the landholder. But at the moment, a developer can say, "Oh, I'm just going to buy the credits off the trust and leave it at that because they get a turnaround in 3 weeks." We have taken the opportunity to establish these sites across New South Wales. As I said, only two of them at this point in time well, sorry, three of them are financially viable. They've met their total fund deposit. The others are either waiting or are still in assessment, but we've managed to sell only 75% of our TFD on one site. The others are 57, 12, 4, 2, and 0. So, not a huge number of credits yet sold off those sites because when we put a price into these auction processes, we get told price too high for buyers. Well, no, the buyers have a low expectation of what price they have to pay because it's only fair that a landholder be given the opportunity to make a profit. And that's been an issue too. The department has actually termed us profiteers. And yet they turn a blind eye to a developer who might turn a $2 billion profit from an urban development or from, wind farm over time, that sort of thing. But, you know, we want to make a fair living. We want to get a return for our investor. Then and investors, I should say, because there's more than one. Anybody that's, we deal with as a joint venture partner and assist them to get into the process is, an investor because they own the land. So these situations where you've got that happening are stymieing the market. So once this change comes in, there will be certain credits that they can't seek from the trust. They have to go to the market. It will set the market price. And that's the issue. Another issue at the
yep,
moment is that the prices are generally being set by discussions between the developer and the agencies, not
yep.
by the agency simply acting as a matchmaking service and saying, well, here you go, you've got this development, they've got those credits. Talk it about among yourselves and see what you come up with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got a
And,
question from Ed about sodas, which are
yep,
the
strategic
strategic
offset
offset
delivery
delivery
agreements.
agreements.
Yep.
Yeah, can you talk about their impact on the whole system?
Oh, well, it's yet another way the government's subverting the market, isn't it? Uh, so a soda is a way in which particular developments, and generally only energy developments at this stage, can get their project happening sooner and leave the obligation on the department to help them solve it. The big issue with that is we come back to the department doesn't necessarily understand how a market works. They're not they're an environment agency. They're
Yeah.
not a finance agency. They're
Yeah.
not an agency that looks at investment. They're not a venture capital investor or anything like that. So they don't have a concept of how a landholder should be fairly recompensed for participating. So they will look at options for financing biodiversity actions elsewhere that provide some interest or a value into the species elsewhere. But then my concern is, well, they might invest money in a species elsewhere, managing habitat for it or whatever. What obligation is there on that landholder, and more importantly, the next landholder, to continue that work to ensure that that species doesn't go backwards? It becomes, in my mind, a way of, shifting back to what we had before.
Mm.
And if the department does fund an activity on an area of land and that action gets done, if it's not recorded to title, there's no reference that that's actually being done there. If the landholder then, a subsequent landholder goes and puts a stewardship site across that site, do they get the benefit of that species management actions already, in which case it's effectively doubling up? Or is there some way in which they will automatically be a discounted return on that species at that location? It's very messy. And as I said again, it's another way to subvert the market and gets us back to what was the reason the market was established in the first place, which is to ensure consistency, to ensure single use, to ensure that there's adequate valuation of biodiversity impacts. If a development is costing too much on the biodiversity, maybe that's a signal more than anything else. You're on mute, mate.
Yeah, you got me. Nearly made it the whole way through. Look, tons of complexity, tons of signals. Really interesting to hear you go through all that. If people are more interested in this and they want to learn more and and especially from our side, climate tech companies who might be seeing that have a biodiversity benefit or they want to engage in this, like what's the entry point that you recommend?
The entry point would be looking at things like reporting your biodiversity impacts and task force for nature-related financial disclosures, that
Yep.
sort of thing. But also, too, looking at opportunities for investment. There are ways in which, if a company is doing particularly well and they want to become philanthropic, they can purchase credits, which doubles the benefit because
Mm,
they can purchase and retire credits, which gives them a tax advantage, provides an advantage to the landholder who's generating those credits that might otherwise not have much of a market, and means that the land is getting managed. And if they are doing it in a way in which they're approaching the landholder directly, there's opportunities there for being involved in the outcomes of the annual report and things like that. And we certainly
mm.
offer that to our clients of, well, you're a wind farm, you have to report, being European, what your impact on nature is. Well, here you go. Here's what we do every year for you. You can put this straight into your annual report. Thank you very much. Go home. Good night. Um,
Easy.
that's it. Very
Yep.
easy.
It's very
But
easy.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the main ways of entry are
Yep.
start talking to people like ourselves who are primarily on the supply side.
Yep.
There are few, but yeah, there's
Yep.
certainly opportunities to come and talk to us and see what we can arrange or help or assist with.
Perfect.
And certainly when it comes to, data centers and things like that, they've got an impact.
Exactly. Absolutely. We see my background in climate and AI. It's I think they are two immovable forces, the climate crisis and AI, and we've got to use one to help the other, even though it's not as directly linked. But Greg, thank you so much for sharing today. I really, really appreciate it. If and that's great. If people want to throw on the video really quickly, I'm just going to get a screenshot of everyone who's here to mark the ceremony of when we all caught up and talked about how important biodiversity credits were. And so I'll just take off my pin and go full screen if anyone's feeling bold enough to unlock. Please write a thank you in here. Give a little the thumbs up or the applause. But again, Greg, thank you so much for sharing. Three, two, one. A big smile there. Amazing, Greg. Really, really do appreciate that. It's very, really fun to see all that and see how it's progressing. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully we can make some more progress on biodiversity.
Terrific. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks, team. Bye.